one of the kind of major elements that I wanted to note by way of getting started with a few of these tips and strategies is that, at least when I reflect back to my own experience searching for non-academic job opportunities, as in my case, a fairly late stage graduate student, it felt to me like a bit of a puzzle whose pieces I had difficulty visualizing, much less determining how to put together. And this experience varied dramatically from the experience of searching for academic jobs, which I had been in some form or fashion trained to do for most of my graduate school career. So I had a bead on putting together a teaching statement, a diversity statement, a portfolio to support my academic job applications, what a job talk would entail. All of those different steps were fairly clear in a way that professional job searching, at least in my case, felt like it was very much a murky space. And I do resonate with the one experience shared here today of having entered graduate school directly from undergrad and not necessarily accruing very much work experience in between. And so I think sometimes that only maybe deepens a sense of just not really knowing what's out there. So by way of getting started, I just wanted to share, and I know that this is super basic, but I think that sometimes just kind of getting back to basics can be the most helpful thing as we're setting ourselves on a foundation. And so I have found that thinking about job searching in this kind of non-academic context as following something of a process that can be structured, that can entail steps, is a helpful approach. I should note here that I'm going to share particular strategies and steps that you can keep in mind as you approach your search. But I do just want to affirm what we had said earlier, that timeline matters. You might not necessarily follow these steps in order. This isn't a linear process, but just particular steps that if you do pursue them each in a dedicated way, can build toward what we hope will be and are confident will be an impactful, really interesting career that enables you to leverage your PhD effectively. So I'm going to go through what are essentially 8 steps, if you will, toward kind of moving into a professional space. And, I'd love to hear again as we go through, particularly from our participant who does have some of that professional experience, to, speak with us about how having accrued some professional experience already might even be helpful, right, as we're now revisiting this process and moving into a non-ac career potentially again, alongside of an academic one. So the first kind of step that I wanted to note from this more meta perspective is that it sometimes helps as just an initial step to kind of sit down and to get in touch with ourselves and the career that we've built up to this point. And here I just want to be intentional with sharing a couple of points for us. Number one, to note the value of engaging in intentional reflection. As busy doctoral students, it can be difficult to do this and difficult to see the value, and actually sitting down and writing out the skills that we have, the experiences we have, stories that have defined our life in academia or in other spaces in our career, and maybe even spending time with some self-assessments. I can share a few if anyone's interested. There's a completely free website called Imagine PhD, where you can sit down and answer questions that help you get in touch with your priorities, interests, values, and strengths professionally. There's other kinds of assessments out there as well, like the Clifton Strengths Assessment, where you can sort of see where you land in terms of 34 strengths that might define you professionally. But sitting down, getting in touch with yourself is really helpful in noticing the parts of your academic life and experience that really light you up, that get you up in the morning, and noticing those that maybe you find a little bit more alienating. Those things matter, and they matter in terms of helping you find a fulfilling career that you'll want to persist in for quite some time to come. So just something to note there in terms of its importance. The second step is one that we'll elaborate on in just a short while, And this has to do with the importance of telling your professional story. And this is where everything we had discussed earlier about having a LinkedIn, having a working resume, CV as well can do this in an academic context. Having your own personal website, it's awesome that one of you has that. These are all different platforms that you can leverage to advocate for you to interesting colleagues who are coming across your profile on LinkedIn, right, to prospective hiring managers. And we'll talk about ways to put those documents together strategically to capture the attention of these folks, help them understand your demonstrated experience, your skills, which ultimately convey your value add, right, to their hiring companies or organizations. So much of what goes on in the non-academic world is understanding the gaps that companies, right, whether they're nonprofits or they're in industry, they have particular organizational business needs. They're looking to fill them. And it's then the job of the applicant to convey value add, right? What's distinguishing about you? And that's where you can tell your story. And we will get into the details of this using these kinds of platforms, right? But thinking about them in that lens, I think, is helpful. Once you have some of these documents in order, this is a great time to do the work of making some connections, right? And I think, Carla was emphasizing this earlier in terms of if you make connections with colleagues in industries or fields of interest, they can help you in many ways. And Carla in particular was emphasizing how they can actually share their resume that they crafted in order to position them into their roles, right? There are many, many things that conversations with colleagues can do for you. They can educate you on fields of interest. They can provide an insider's perspective, which is a tough thing to get when you're out there looking for roles on LinkedIn, Idealist, other spaces. You don't get that insider's look. And it could be a bit of puzzling around what is it that employers actually mean when they describe certain qualifications or duties, right? Making connections through things like informational interviews, outreach to people on LinkedIn. We know that for some, you're on a bit of an accelerated timeline, outreach to recruiters. All of that will give you an information base that you can use in order to engage in the next step, which is now tailoring your documents and tailoring your portfolio. And again, this reaches into what Carla was saying earlier about how a resume really should be, in a way mirroring the language of available positions that you do come across when you're applying for roles. So it's so much about understanding that business need or that gap that's kind of out there and reframing the way that you describe yourself on your resume. You can do this on your LinkedIn too, utilizing keywords, utilizing language of the job description to show alignment between your candidacy and the needs of the role. That tailoring piece is important, a little bit more about that to come. Finally, I want to get to our kind of second phase of exploring our non-AC, professional job search process here. Once you have a sense of career pathways of interest, you've had conversations, you have your material set up, the next step is typically that you start to be called in for interviews, right? And so there's a whole kind of strategy that you can rely on to interview effectively, right? To research the folks who will be interviewing you, to ask questions, think about what those questions are. Sometimes employers will be really transparent about who will be interviewing you and what the format will be like. Sometimes they won't be. And so part of this process involves some gentle but relevant self-advocacy in this process to ask questions to get the information you need in order to engage in a prepared way. Another part of it involves preparing for things like behavioral interview questions, which in my experience tend to be the toughest, where you're sort of put on the spot to draw from aspects of your academic or professional career, where you've had to navigate challenges, right? Where there are certain sort of moments professionally that interviewers will want to draw from you to gauge how you might behave in the context of their company or organization. So learning to prepare for those as well. Storytelling effectively is an important part of that. Then we get to the offer stage. And one thing I wish people had told me when I was applying for my first non-academic job is the importance of negotiating your salary, understanding the full range of funds that have been designated toward the position that you've been offered, understanding the amount of leverage that you have once that company has made an offer for you, doing your research, making a data-driven, informed decision about how much to try to negotiate up, and when it also makes sense to actually stop negotiating. It's a delicate kind of thing. Last two comments I'll make here before concluding this piece is just to note, and I find, and again, I know that one of our participants has professional experience, another is coming right from kind of the academic world. Just wanted to note, a lot of times for PhDs, it does come as a surprise when you're entering a new role that there's going to be anywhere from a 3 to kind of 12-month ramp up process where you're learning that job. And coming from the world that we've been cultivated in, where specialization and information is currency and it's a source of esteem, right? We spend that currency, we spend what we know day to day navigating the university. It can be hard and it can be kind of scary to be in a space where you feel like maybe you don't know things, or you're given a project and you're not sure what the next step is. It's been my experience in the professional world that you navigate a lot of ambiguity. And so recognizing that will be there, and it's a totally standard part of the process and it's a safe thing, just another kind of piece that I wanted to acknowledge. And finally, when we look at sort of trends that are guiding our labor market today, it's not uncommon for folks to leave their professional roles in anywhere from 1 to 3 years. People are moving around a lot. All that is to say that whatever role that you land, particularly if it's in the professional world, and this is really where there's a contrast between this and academia, it might not be common for you to accrue some skills, experiences, and then move on. But just to think of ourselves as career builders and lifelong learners, and sort of thinking beyond just let me land that first role, as important as that is, right? Or that first role beyond graduate school. So I'm going to move into another sort of piece of the talk here. But before I do, let me just pause for any questions, anything anybody might want to add or comment on before proceeding. Well, I work in a little water break as well. Okay, sounds good. So I'll keep going. And again, do feel free to interject if anything is on your mind as we go here. So what I wanted to do now, having, with this kind of meta perspective in mind and still informed by our earlier conversation, is to go through ways that we can start to use LinkedIn today to launch different parts of this job search strategy, particularly steps 1 through 3, where we get to know ourselves, we work on telling our story, and then we begin to utilize those aspects of our search to start making connections and developing opportunities for career education. Again, I do want to acknowledge we come at this from different places. Some of us have a LinkedIn, some don't. But one of the things that I find to be a truism about LinkedIn, and this is also true for any element of, at least in my case, my job career portfolio, is that these are dynamic living documents that are both backward and forward looking, and they change and evolve as much as I do, which seems to happen with surprising frequency. So there's always room to continue to iterate and evolve no matter where we kind of are in this process here. Okay, so just a little bit here about how we can approach telling our story on LinkedIn. There's 3 elements of putting together a LinkedIn profile that I want to sort of highlight here. And again, these elements are relevant particularly for your resume development process. So just note their applications more broadly. Last thing, FYI, I am going to be sharing these slides following this talk. So just kind of take this in for now and know there will be more time later to digest this more fully. So with this, in terms of putting together a headline for a LinkedIn, right, this tends to be kind of that line that comes right underneath the profile picture of a LinkedIn user. It's the billboard in a way of your LinkedIn profile, okay? This is going to be the line that recruiters see when they're searching for you vis-a-vis some keywords. It's the line that people see whenever any LinkedIn user is engaging in activities. So if you're liking posts, things like this, or when your profile is displayed under the professional network section, it's that headline that's right there. So this is a surprisingly important element of a profile that tends to be overlooked. And yet again, its significance really can't be understated. What's really important about a headline, and this here, I want to emphasize, these are some tips that you can start to apply elsewhere in your portfolio development, is to begin to define yourself, not so much by your job title alone, right? So not so much the strictly PhD candidate, economics at Johns Hopkins University, right? Or PhD candidate, political science, right, at Hopkins, right? But to think about yourself in terms of your skill set and your specialization, to really use some action-oriented language around this. So what I advise, and this goes back to some of that self-reflection, is to start to think about the skills that you use in your roles as graduate students day to day, right? The education piece, the research piece, communications, right? Leadership, teamwork, mentoring. There's so many different skills, right, that we use. How might you turn some of those action-oriented skills, those verbs, if you will, what you do, into nouns that describe who you are? And to do it in ways that are true to your identity, that are holistic, right? That really say, that really convey a broad spectrum of your personality, as well as sharing your skill set as a professional. So I have a couple of different examples that I've shared here, drawn from folks who are on LinkedIn now. I was able to grab these just a couple of days ago, so live examples here of folks who are using LinkedIn who are in the political or social sciences. And you can see that they do this in a variety of ways. You have one example, I'm looking at our second kind of line here, right? Someone who immediately kind of leads with, they're a sociologist, they're leading with their expertise, but then they get into their skills. Qualitative and quantitative social science researcher, policy and data analyst, right? So we can see some of those essential skill sets that are highlighted, dovetailed with their expertise, right? Similarly, we have qualitative researcher, political scientist, UX researcher. So the skills and the expertise, they're kind of, they kind of live together side by side. Another way that you might go about doing this is to think about, and this is just one possible formula that you can rely on, to think about constituencies that you currently serve within the context of your academic career. Say students would be one that many of us are committed to, or constituencies that you hope to serve down the line, that your research benefits in some way, right? So you might use the formula that says something like helping X to do Y. So in my case, I have a job title that doesn't tend to resonate with very many people outside of the Hopkins orbit. I'm the Associate Director of PHutures. Within Hopkins, people know what that means. Outside, there might be a bit of a question mark of what's PHutures and what does that mean, right? And so I lead with empowering graduate students and postdoctoral fellows to design their lives, right? It goes right into, okay, this is the constituency that this person serves, right? And then we'll, say more information about what my precise job title is. So in a nutshell, starting to think about your headline in terms of conveying a bit about your values, your personality, and your skills, be a really helpful way of going about this. And it'll also help with some So thinking about the algorithm of LinkedIn and that keyword searchable aspect of this as well, leading with those skill sets when you think about what recruiters will be looking for. Okay, and again, if there's any questions, thoughts, anything coming to mind, do feel free to interject anytime. I'm just doing the quick kind of nutshell version of some of this before soon turning things over to Carla. The other section of LinkedIn that I wanted to emphasize here is the About section of LinkedIn. This is an area that in my conversations with students, they have conveyed tends to be a bit intimidating to write because you have a lot of space that you can fill up with different content about yourselves. And oftentimes, people really don't say very much about themselves in this section at all if they have it filled in. And one of the things to kind of note about LinkedIn is that what the elements of it give to you are opportunities. And so the more content that you can fill in thoughtfully and strategically, the more you take advantage of opportunities to let colleagues and prospective hiring managers and recruiters learn about you. So with an About section, what's really kind of interesting and critical about this moment and this section here is that it's a moment for you to narrate your professional journey, to say something about your personality and values in a way that you don't normally have space to do on a resume, and that you really won't have that opportunity to add anywhere outside of how you portray yourself during an actual interview with a prospective employer. So this is a kind of a great section for you to think about how you can portray yourself as an individual in terms of your relevant skills and experiences, and to say a little bit of information about where you'd like to go professionally. So I'll say a little bit about the example that I've included here. This is an example that I pulled from LinkedIn, again, quite recently through a social scientist that's on here. And the way that this person briefly has gone about crafting the About section is to lead with highlighting their most relevant skill sets and experiences. So right off the bat, right, you see quantitative leading, mixed methods social scientist, user experience researcher, and program evaluator, right? So you've got those three kind of critical components to their professional portfolio before they elaborate on that in additional detail. In the second paragraph, they elaborate on the specifics of the role they have now and the industry that they're in and the value that they add to it. And then this person takes advantage of the third and final paragraph to get into sort of the full breadth of experiences and skills that they have to offer. And you can see at the bottom, I would say that this paragraph, as we're sort of thinking about this as readers and writers, might have a little bit too much content here. Remember when you're putting together a LinkedIn, that most people interface with LinkedIn on their phones through the app. So the more that you can cut down on your material, have short, accessible paragraphs, maybe even say a little bit more than this person does about your story and your values, the more you'll hook those readers and kind of keep them engaged and keep them lingering on your profile, right, for a little bit longer than they might otherwise. But if you note at the very, very bottom of this person's About section, they go ahead and just kind of dump a number of different technical skills that they have. So they get into qualitative research skills, exactly how they go about doing that qualitative research, interviews, focus groups, card sorting, journey mapping, you name it. And then they get into their proficiency in things like R, SQL, Stata, SPSS, things like that, right? This is helpful because you have to think about, again, LinkedIn from the perspective of, keyword searches and how recruiters are going to potentially be searching for you. And the more that you can add these keywords in about your skill sets, the more that you can be found by recruiters and others who will be searching for you, right? So part of this is searching for others and finding ways to do that. And another part is crafting an effective profile that helps you come up more when people are searching for you or people like you. And then the last piece that I wanted to kind of get into here is the experience section of our LinkedIn profiles. And note that there is so much area of potential overlap between what I'm sharing here about a LinkedIn and developing a resume, right? So a lot of these strategies would be very much applicable across the board, if not directly so. The first kind of point that I just kind of want to note about this is that it helps when you are articulating your experience, right? Accrued in graduate school, accrued in your professional life up to this point, accrued through internships, anywhere where you've gathered experience. It helps to articulate it through adding bullet points that get to everything we had mentioned earlier about explaining the how of the achievements that you have, right? Using that kind of action-oriented language that culminates in impact, right? So how you did what you did. And in a more basic sense, it helps to include these bullet points in the first place. One of the things that's not uncommon at all when perusing LinkedIn is to find many professionals who don't actually have their experience articulated. They just have their job titles listed out there. And that again becomes a bit of a missed opportunity for recruiters and relevant colleagues to actually understand what your job title means, right? And your value add and the skills that you have to offer. On the topic of job titles, by the way, it may be possible for you, depending on the flexibility you have. This might be a great place, by the way, to have conversations with people like Carla, faculty members, others who are advising you about ways that you might even represent yourself beyond your academic title. So say this person here is a PhD candidate in sociology. That's fine. We all know what that means in an academic context. In a non-academic context, it might help for this person to represent themselves in terms of their skills, similar to a headline, right? So, something like, qualitative researcher in X context might resonate more with a non-academic audience than, say, kind of highlighting your PhD candidacy. So it's just something else to kind of think about here as we're crafting these sections. But just to note then, in terms of putting these bullet points together, just a few pointers to keep in mind. It helps to use bullet points, have everything neat and organized, and to lead with strong action verbs, really utilizing active voice whenever you can, to be specific and organized, and to quantify wherever you can the nature of your activities and the outcomes that you attained. So say you have something like teaching experience, to actually sort of count out the number of students that you might have taught over the course of your graduate school career, to give prospective managers a sense of the scale on which you've utilized your communications experience, your mentoring experience, everything that goes into teaching, right? At the very bottom, one of the things I like about the example that we have here with the sociologist is that this person actually quantifies their dissertation research and does another thing too, which is to show the value of their research to a non-specialist audience, right? So we've got multiple bullets that get into skill sets, right? How they did, what they do, how they conduct their research. And then it culminates in analyzed findings and presented conclusions in a 6-chapter dissertation, informing social scientists and policymakers, so we have a sense of stakeholders, right? Who does this matter to on, and then they get into the nature of their research, right? And why it's important, why it's valuable, right? So again, this in many ways, what I'm sharing is just the tip of the iceberg. There's lots more that we could cover here. And I think for lots of what I've said up to this point in time, we could do many follow-up sessions that get into these things in detail. For now, I think I'm going to kind of put a pin in these comments and leave it there. we could potentially get into a bit of an activity later. But I'm going to turn things over to Carla, who also has lots more to share around some of the specific applications of this content for folks in political social science who are kind of thinking through this material with us today.
Thanks, Christine. So I have some slides I want to share with everyone, and it'll just sort of walk us through the conversation I want to have, which I think really builds on what Christine introduced. So thank you, Christine. I think this is going to be an excellent segue into what I want to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share this. Hold on. It worked earlier, so I'm hoping it'll work now. Let's see. Let's see. No, it's not working there. Hold on one second. Christine, am I still the host on here?
You should be, and we were just able to see your screen.
Yeah, okay. So I don't know why it's not showing the slides this time. 1 second.
Sure. Take your time. And as we're waiting for Carla's presentation to come up, if anyone has any questions or anything you want to share or drop into the chat, please do feel free to do that as well.
Okay, let me try one more time and see if it works.
Okay.
Aha, here we go.
Very good.
All right, is everybody seeing that now? Fantastic. Okay, great. Okay, so let me just put this on slideshow. Okay, so I just wanted to build a little bit on what Christine introduced today, and also just talk about sort of the strategy in more detail in terms of how we move through this sort of non-ACT job search. But before I begin with that, I just wanted to sort of introduce, this sort of why question, right? Why are we even considering looking for non-academic jobs? And it's I think very much the case in the context of the job market today that students are increasing their interest in non-academic jobs for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about. And it's also true that I think most graduate students pursuing PhDs have a lot of insight into the tenure track and academic job pathways through their faculty mentorship and other means. So I think what tends to be missing is talking about this other pathway for professional careers. And so I think it's really important that we focus a little bit on that. There was a great piece a couple of days ago, which I would encourage you all to read, called "Old the Places They'll Go with a PhD" from the Chronicle of Higher Education, which came out just a couple of days ago by Audrey Williams-June, which talks specifically about some of these trends. And I think it's really important to sort of contextualize our discussion today, because I think it's something that needs to be increased across all academic institutions, is to discuss these non-AC pathways. So in the social sciences, this is all according to Williams-June, we're seeing that about 40 to 50% of PhD students land a job in an academic institution after graduation, right? So that's a pretty good number. We see about 30 to 40% of new PhDs securing postdocs and tenure track jobs after graduation. So still a little bit less, but again, we're seeing about half of our PhD student population moving into academic professions. That leaves the other half, right? And so I think it's really important, to provide that statistical context about why this is really key, that we're pursuing all professional avenues that would be of interest to us as we complete our PhD programs. And we've also seen, according to this article, and I think it's really relevant across different disciplines, not just the social sciences, is an increase in PhD students securing non-academic jobs over the last 2 decades, right? So that's an increase of about 10 to 15% over the last 2 decades. So I think there are several trends that I think are important to address. And I think that's why we're having, these sessions. And also there's a lot of appeal to non-ACT jobs, I think, for students coming out of PhD programs. Issues concerning salary and benefits, right? Depending on the industry you're looking at, the salaries may be comparable or higher. in non-academic jobs, depending on the area. There is a certain level of job security that I think a lot of PhD students are looking for, particularly after several years in a graduate program. And there's also obviously considerations around work-life balance that I think are really important to consider. You know, if you're working typically in a professional career, you're going to have very different sort of work hours than you're going to have in a tenure track or academic job. And so these are all sort of reasons why we see some increase in consideration for non-ac jobs that I think are important to consider as you're coming to the end of your graduate program. So one of the things I want to sort of highlight, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I just thinking about the kinds of transferable skills that PhDs have that are really key and important, both in tenure track or academic jobs and non-academic jobs as well. So when we think about issues, I think particular skills, research comes to the forefront, right? So you have been conducting research probably longer than you've been in your PhD program. You've been doing this largely autonomously with some guidance from your faculty mentor. And these are the kinds of skills that not everybody has, okay? So it's really important not to sort of downplay this. I think it's really important to think about how research skills are transferable. So you know, typically over a PhD program, you're learning methods. So you're learning at, you know, the processes through which we gather and analyze data. You're thinking about filtering and categorizing information, right, for relevance. You're thinking about analyzing social, political, and economic trends, right? And you're also thinking about the audiences that you're trying to speak to when you're involved in that research process. And so I think what's really key in all the fields that I have worked in, nonprofit, research and advocacy, and government especially, you are researching all the time, right? Whether it's outside sources to support policy change or policy development, which is what I was working on, whether it's writing speeches, which I was tasked to do pretty early on in my government career, right? Where you have to really have informed information, right? Or just researching the institutional history, right? And how that sort of plays into a government or a country's position at that moment on a particular issue. So research becomes fundamental in all of the sectors that I have worked in, and it is something that I think very few people have had as much experience in. And I think PhD students are really key assets when we think about that transferable skill. Second is writing, okay? And I can't underestimate this because this is fundamental, again, in every professional career that you have, whether it's writing an email or writing an issue brief, right? Which was something I had to do all the time, speeches, advocacy letters. If you're working for a nonprofit, one of the key aspects is writing letters that are convincing to try to get policymakers to adapt or evolve their position, right? With regards to a particular social or political or economic issue. So writing becomes really fundamental. And because of the kinds of writing that PhD students do, it is very much the case that it's easier to learn other forms of writing. And so, you know, when I entered government, I had never written a policy brief before, right? But I had written chapters, right? They're very different, but I was able to pick up very quickly, right, the new rules of this new format, or this new type of writing. I had never written a speech for, you know, a politician before, right? These skills were something I learned on the job, but because I had so much experience writing before, it was easily transferable. I could pick up those specifics rather easily. And so writing becomes fundamental. And so these two skills are something that PhD students in particular have a huge amount of experience with that isn't always reflected in the more general population, right? So I think that's really key, not to sort of discount these, but play them up when you're applying for new positions. Communication becomes also very important, right? And I should have added collaboration there as well. So communication, you're teaching, you're collaborating with faculty members, you're doing all manner of presentations at conferences. those kinds of skills are things that you have more practice than more people do, particularly in their day-to-day career pathways. So that is something to really think about and include. And I think it's also important because PhD students, you are typically speaking to an academic audience, sometimes also a more applied government or policy audience. If you're in the social sciences, that will translate very clearly, I think, to the kinds of sectors that we're going to be talking a little bit about today. So those three areas in particular are really fundamental, and oftentimes we think they're not as important in other sectors. And frankly, they are at the core of a lot of the work in professional sectors. So think about how you play that up, how you explain the sort of practical ways that you've been able to hone these skills. And of course, there are a slew of other kinds of skills that are transferable, which we can talk about a little bit today when we get to the Q&A a little bit. Okay, so one of the other things I wanted to talk about is just, and I know some of you have already begun this process and are on different timelines in terms of thinking about your application process, right? But thinking about the timeline is also reflective of the kind of materials you have prepared and the kind of materials you still need to develop. So these are not in any particular order, but they are all things you want to think about starting to create. The first thing I always tell students is think about the list of organizations or the types of jobs that you are interested in, right? So if you're interested in think tanks, which think tanks and why? Which ones are really doing the kind of innovative work that speaks to perhaps what you've been working on during your graduate program, right? So there's some kind of transferability there in terms of area, or ones that you've worked with sort of as a consultant, or perhaps you've engaged with those folks when you were doing your research. What organizations and what kinds of positions can you list out that are really the ones that you want to focus on for your search? It's also important to think about the deadlines for these applications, right? We were talking a little bit about timelines. Academic jobs are very different, right? They tend to all come out, particularly in the United States, late summer, early fall. And so you're preparing those materials largely in the summer and some, in the early fall, and making those applications then with the sort of interview and campus visit process happening sometime in the spring. For non-AC jobs, these are rolling, right? So they're happening all the time. I would say that typically we see sort of an increase in these kinds of advertised roles in the springtime and then again in the fall. So thinking summer tends to be a little quieter, so it may be a time to sort of think about preparing those materials as well. And they typically are posted anywhere from 2 weeks to a couple of months. So they're not, it's really important you have something sort of ready, even a draft or a template of some of these documents that you can modify to sort of reflect the specifics of the actual job you're applying for. So just think about, if you don't have any resume, but you have a CV, maybe it's time to start sort of formatting, a new version of this that you can then use to apply to non-AC jobs. Reference requests and letters. This is really, really important. We know this for tenure track jobs, ask early, right? So if you're thinking you're going to need a particular faculty member's letter, etc., in the next 2 months, you need to ask them early, right? And I would say give them all the information that they require. So things like, what is the job? What is the deadline? Are they going to email me and ask me for a reference, or are they going to ask for a letter? Those kinds of things are really key to include in your request. And I would say, please, if you're asking faculty, make sure that you're telling them these are non-academic jobs that you're applying for, and therefore they may need to modify the sort of template that they typically use for tenure track applications, right? So think about, can they speak to you as a person and your ambitions in the sort of non-academic realm as well, okay? Because that's really, really important, right? So they can't just use the sort of template of their research is exciting, sure, but what kind of person are they, and how do their ambitions sort of fit with this job? So that's really key. The other thing I would say is, if you have anybody else that knows you well, knows your skills, anybody you've worked with in a professional capacity, maybe you interned, maybe you did interviews with an organization or offered your skills for a couple of months while you were you're doing your field work, whatever it is that they can speak to that are sort of non-academic positions, I think that would be another way to showcase your sort of diversity in terms of your skill sets, right? So for me personally, when I was applying for jobs, I had worked with the government and worked on some of their policy formation as a grad student. And so I included some of those references when I was applying for professional jobs, because I think it showcased not only do I have faculty references, but I have others as well that can speak to my sort of overall, professional skill set. So if you have them, great. If you don't panic. It's fine, right? You can still use faculty references. I think that's absolutely fine, but just make the person who's writing your letter aware, right, that this is a non-academic job, and anything you'd like them to include. Oftentimes I would include the link to the job so that they know what this job is looking for. Sometimes they might ask you to sort of draft parts of the letter so that they can then add their flavor to it. That's also very useful, and it's about essentially creating the potential for faculty to have time to write these. So as much time as you can give them, as much information as you can give them, really, really important. Resume, we talked a little bit about this, the converted CV, right? This is really key, right? Typically in the nonprofits, they're looking at one page, which is so hard to convert a CV to a resume when you have multiple pages. So I feel your pain. If this is the challenge that you're experiencing, please reach out to me, because I'm happy to sort of help with that, because I know that can be a really daunting process. But it's really important, again, that we reflect the format and the length that is typically used in those sectors. So if you're looking at the nonprofit sector, if you have access to anybody's resume who already works for the organization, take a look at their formatting, right? Take a look at where they put, their language skills versus their previous job experience, etc. That's really, really key. And I think that can help you sort of reflect a format that they are familiar with, right? And I think that's useful. Depending on the job, government jobs, there might be room for a little bit more length in there. But again, you want to think about strategically, what is it they need to fill this job? Where are the areas of fit that I need to highlight in this resume, given the sort of length constraints that I'm engaging with. So again, resume very different to a CV, so you have to think about how to convert that. Cover letters, this is something everyone loathes writing. They are difficult. They are really, really difficult, and they need to be specific to the job, right? Having a template, that's okay to start off, but when you're at the point of like, I want to apply for this particular position, you need to modify that templated cover letter to make sure that it's speaking to the duties, responsibilities that are advertised in the position, okay? And not just listing them, right? We don't just list, I'm a good researcher. How are you a good researcher? Give me an example of something that you've done that exemplifies that skill set. And that should be true of everything you talk about, whether it's language skills, policy analysis, whatever it is. It's not just I've done this before, this is an example of how I did this. And I think that, displays fit, right? That I could bring that level of skill to the job. So it's really important to provide clear and concrete examples throughout your cover letters that speak to the specific skills and duties that are requested in the job. And also, I think, as Christine mentioned, very, very importantly, tell your story a little bit. Why are you excited about this job, right? Why are you seeking this kind of position in this organization? How do your values, your sort of overall, values and the mission of the institution, how do they fit with who you are as a person? That's really important, because even if you have the skills, which most of you do for these jobs, it's about who is this person I'm going to be working with, right? Are they somebody I can get along with? Are they somebody that, cares about the institution in sort of its long-term and overall mission? Those are the kinds of things that they're going to be looking for in a cover letter. And of course, that'll translate again into the interview process as well. Okay. Writing sample, this is, not something that's always requested. However, when it is requested, they are not looking for a chapter or a thesis, right? They are looking for typically a couple of pages of writing that highlights, firstly, that you can write, right? That you have that skill set, and B, that you have some knowledge of the area that they are working in, of the discipline they're working in. So it's typically 2 to 5 pages max that they're looking for. So you want to think about, if that's something you need, what could you select, or what could you use that you've already written that would be able to be modified to showcase or to, you know, satisfy that requirement. So if you're thinking about writing sample, make sure that you're thinking about the page lengths for these particular positions. Okay, those are really, really important. Okay, given that we're running out of time a little bit, I think I'm gonna try to move through this a little bit. Hold on one second here. Okay. Okay, just very quickly, engaging. How do we engage with the sort of non-academic professional community? This is a challenge for everyone. Okay, how do I meet people after a 2-year pandemic? This is an ongoing question, right? It's very difficult. So I think your challenges are unique because we're coming out of a time where that sort of face-to-face time has been significantly reduced. And I think it's been a real challenge to sort of get out in the world and make yourself known. So now that we're coming to a point where more events are occurring, I think it's really important that students engage with these communities, right? So if it's networking events that happen, you know, in Baltimore, DC, they'll advertise these sort of networking events for career fairs, those kinds of things. Attend, right? Talk to people, start to get to know, you know, what kind of jobs are being advertised and what kinds of requirements, what kind of people they're looking for. Because I think that that's always a really important mechanism to sort of start to make connections. Panels, right? If you're at a think tank, thinking about think tanks, I know some of you work there, that's great. They have panels all the time, right? Often open to the public, whether it's virtual or whether it's face-to-face. There's so many think tanks in DC and New York. It's one of the sort of hubs for this kind of work. That's where you want to sort of make yourself known. Go to the panels, right? Attend these sessions, ask a question, you know, give people your card. If you don't have cards, you should get them made with your email and your contact information, and give them out, and go to these sessions, because I think they're really important ways of trying to get your network built in these sort of non-ACT communities. And it's really, really important, particularly in Washington, where I've worked. It's fundamental. Okay, so these kinds of things are really important. Meet for coffee with people who are already in these organizations. Okay, I know sometimes people don't want to do that and they will ignore you. Fair enough, we move on. But if you've gone to a session, you say, we should meet for coffee. I'd love to talk to you about your organization. You know, I'm really interested in the work you do. I did that when I moved to the United States, you know, a few years back. It was fantastic. I learned a ton. People like talking about their work. And if they can take, you know, a half an hour out of their day to someone who's really interested and get to know you, particularly if they know there's something coming up that they have to fill, a position they have to fill, even if there's nothing open yet, it's just really useful to have a chat, particularly organizations that you're already interested in, right? You already think their work is important. This helped me a lot, is sort of not feeling shy and being able to sort of have these conversations with people. Don't be overly pushy. Don't email them 100 times. Don't call them 100 times. But again, you know, there's a way to do this organically that's really, really useful. And oftentimes people are really open to having, you know, face-to-face meetings, or even virtual meetings, if that's more in line with what they're comfortable with. One of the things that I don't think students always think about, this might be useful maybe as an earlier stage in your graduate program, but offering your services early as a consultant or intern. So I know we typically discourage grad students from doing anything but their thesis, which is fair. I understand writing the thesis is important. However, right, some of the other things that you can do, particularly if you're at a later stage in your writing, or if you're in the fieldwork stage where you're doing sort of similar or transferable things, consulting with organizations that you're possibly interviewing, right, or doing field work with, or partnering with. These are the kinds of ways that you can offer your services early, and they get to know sort of you as a professional colleague. And so if there's a way to do that, or you're already doing that in some way, I think that's really useful to sort of make and engage with people. When I was a PhD student, as I mentioned, worked on a government policy creation initiative, and it was, I think, fundamental in launching me into the professional world, right? Because I was working on policy development with the government. It was funded. There were publications that came out of it that were more professional. And so I was doing that at the same time as pursuing my PhD. And I interviewed these folks as well for my thesis. So it was really sort of symbiotic. If you can create these kinds of symbiotic partnerships, it's always, I think, useful, as long as it doesn't sort of take up too much of your time away from your thesis writing. I think it's something useful to try to pursue. Okay, so I'm done. Yay. Okay, so those are sort of the main things that I wanted to bring to bear here. There was just two little things I wanted to mention before we sort of open up for questions again. It's just some anecdotal advice that I thought was really important to impart. A couple of things that aren't always easy to explain, but I wanted to explain this since we're in this session. Two things I picked up on when I was applying for and sort of working in the professional sphere. The first thing is that you will be obliged to wear different hats and play different roles when you're no longer in an academic environment, okay? And what do I mean by that? Once you're working for government, you are now a government representative. You are no longer the individual that was writing their PhD, okay? So you have to think about that when you're thinking about where the next stage of your professional career will be. So when you're applying to a think tank, for instance, I will now be representing this organization, right? I don't represent me as an individual and my ideas. I represent this organization. So am I comfortable with that, right? There are some trade-offs that you have to think about when you're selecting, the kinds of organizations you want to be a part of. There's a little bit less autonomy when you're moving out of academia into the professional spaces. And, I struggled with that when I worked for government in particular, because of every event I went to, I was now a representative of the government. I was not Carla, the PhD student who has ideas about this, right? So you have to be very careful. And I won't talk about the missteps I made when I first started, but we can if we want to. Some funny stories there. But those are the kinds of things you really want to think about. Am I able to sort of wear these different hats? And there are trade-offs that come with that when you're thinking about where you want to go next. And the last thing I think is, unfortunately, we know that there are preconceived notions associated with people who get doctorate degrees, right, with PhDs. And oftentimes they are misconceptions, complete misconceptions about the kind of person you are, the kind of knowledge you have, the kind of, so I would just say at this point, you need to think about showcasing the best of you, okay? And that is, you are a hard worker, right? You have a lot of knowledge that will come to bear on the organization that you're moving to. You are a team player. That's an important one, okay? Because oftentimes PhDs are not necessarily naturally conceived of as a team player. And you don't see yourself as overqualified or above, right, what the organization is doing. And so that is really important to impart in your materials, but also in the way that you conduct yourself in the interview process. And I'm not saying it's, again, these are misconceptions that I think the general population has about people with PhDs, but I think it's important to acknowledge them in yourself so that when you're applying for jobs, you're sort of counteracting some of those anyway, right? So this idea that you can work with people, that you can sort of learn, because for me, I learned the most working in government and think tanks and nonprofits. I learned a ton, and I was so thankful to be around people who were willing to sort of bring me along and let me sort of observe and learn the way that they interacted in those professional career spaces. And so as a lifetime learner, that's something you want to project really clearly when you're going through this process. And again, this overqualification thing is something that is one of the biggest misconceptions, right? That can often be tied to salary expectations. So that's something that you might have to sort of deal with, particularly when you're at the negotiation process, if you've gone through that process so far. So thinking about how to counteract, right, to some extent, those misconceptions in the projection of yourself through your materials and through your interview process, I think is fundamental. So that's all I had to say. I'm going to keep quiet. I know we only have a couple of minutes, but if there are any questions, I'd love to hear them.